to the tradition, his father was a small Raja, what in later times in India would be called a Zemindar, someone who had a large tract of land, a good income from that, a nice house, a small, you might say, palace or darbar. His father was a Raja of this small territory centered in a place called Kapilavastu. According to the tradition, his mother was from another small kingdom nearby. And when it came time for her to have her first son, she decided to go back to her father's house and have the child there. So she set off, but she didn't make it. Before she got there, the child came, and they took refuge in a grove of trees in a place called Lumbini. And that's where the Buddha was born. And the place was marked by a pillar put up by the Emperor Ashoka in the 20th year of his reign. So what we can say for sure is Lumbini was recognized as the place of the birth of the Buddha in the time of the Emperor Ashoka, about 200 years after the birth. That still leaves the question of where was Kapilavastu? He wasn't raised in Lumbini, he went back to Kapilavastu. And this question is difficult to answer. We have one, and the Indians have one. If you go north from Lumbini, northwest a ways, you come to a place called Tilorakot. And there they have done some archaeological digging. They have found a 1 mile square area bounded by a wall with a moat around it. They have not excavated inside, but they have excavated 2 of the gateways. And the bottom layer of the wall is certainly Mauryan. What's on the surface are monastic remains and certainly come after the time of the Buddha. The place fits perfectly with the description we have in the Buddhist texts. A darbar at the foot of the hills, with the hills behind and the Himalayas beyond that, and the river going along the side with the village on the other side. Everything's there. Well, yes, but rivers in this part of the world seldom stay in the same bed for 2,500 years. It's unlikely that river was there. So one can cast some doubt. If you go back to Lumbini and across the Indian border, which is not far away, and about 3 miles south, you come to a place called Piprava, where the Indians have also done excavations. What they have uncovered there are monastic remains and also a very ancient stupa, which may be one of the original stupas I'll speak about later. They've also found some little clay seals, tiny little things, that are inscribed with an inscription, Kapilavastu Mahasanghasya. So they were issued by a large Buddhist community of Kapilavastu. And so on the basis of that they say, aha, this is Kapilavastu. Well, maybe, because seals are like postage stamps. You put them on letters and send them. Did they originate here, or were they sent from Kapilavastu? Another thing we know is that toward the end of the Buddha's life, Kapilavastu, the town, the place where he lived, was destroyed in a war. So did the people later move down south a ways to this place, which may well have been a part of Kapilavastu? It's hard to say. I think Tilorakot is more likely, but until some more evidence comes to light, that's all we can say. According to the stories, he was raised in comfortable circumstances in his father's darbar, married at a young age, about 16, as was the custom in those days. A young lady called Yasodhara, and had a son by the name of Rahula. Sometime later, when he was about 29, 30 years old, he took a ride one day out through the villages of his father's estate. And as they were going along, he saw several things that disturbed him. First, a sick man being taken on a litter to the doctor. And he asked the charioteer, "What's the matter with that fellow?" He says, "He's sick." They went on further and they saw an old man walking along, leaning on his cane, feeling his way. And the Buddha said, "What's the matter with him?" The charioteer says, "He's old. We all get that way if we live long enough." And they went on further and they saw a group of people taking a body out to be burned. And he says, "What happened to that fellow?" The charioteer says, "He's dead." Now perhaps it didn't happen exactly like this, but what did happen was he began to reflect on what he saw around him. The suffering in the world, sickness, old age, the inevitable death. And he began to ask the question, what is the meaning of this and why? And it bothered him so much that he finally decided he would have to go and seek the answer. So again, according to the stories, he left in the middle of the night, went south into Magad, looking for a teacher. Over the next several years, he studied with several famous teachers. And at one stage, he decided that the only way I'm really going to get this answer is if I practice tapasya, penance, austerity. So he starved himself, slept on a bed of nails, all of those things. And you still see, occasionally, a statue of the Buddha sitting in the lotus posture, all skin and bones, which commemorates this period in his life. He did this for 6 years. And at the end of 6 years, he said, "No, this is not the answer. I still don't have the answer. This is not the way." By this time, he'd become a well-known teacher himself, and he had a few young disciples. So he called the disciples, he sat down under a tree, took a bath, cleaned himself up, had somebody cook a nice meal for him. And at that, the young disciples said, "Uh-oh, he's giving up the quest." So we go off. They went off. And he said, "I'm just going to sit here under this tree until I have the answer." And then he said one night as he was sitting there under the tree, suddenly he had the answer. In a flash that he referred to as enlightenment or awakening, in any case, Buddhi. And the place where this occurred, of course, is Bodh Gaya. He spent the next several days thinking about what he'd experienced, walking back and forth in front of the tree, reflecting on it, trying to figure out how he would explain this to others. And then he went off in search of his companions, his disciples. He heard they'd gone to Varanasi, so he went there in search of them. They weren't there. But he found them outside the city at a place that is today called Sarnath. And there he explained to the young man what he had experienced. And the Buddhists refer to this incident as the first preaching of the law. They symbolized the law with a wheel. So this was the first turning of the wheel of the law. Dharma Parivartana, Dharma Chakra Parivartana. He said in this experience, he understood 3 things. He had a memory of his former lives, a knowledge of the death and the birth of beings, and the certainty that now he had put an end to the cause for rebirth in himself. And there would be no more successive rebirths. After this experience and finding his disciples, he began to wander from place to place, talking with people, explaining to them what he had experienced. And he really spent the rest of his life, a long life, another 45 years, wandering around the area which is now Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, preaching to people, talking about what he had experienced. He had no property or possessions except for 8 things he permitted himself. 3 robes to wear, an alms bowl, a razor, a needle to sew up his clothes, a sash to tie his clothes, and a strainer. Now the washing is not what you might think for. One of his earliest ideals was we must have respect for all living beings. You don't kill anything that's living. Now if you take a dipper of water out of a pond or even out of a stream, you get a few insects. So strain it so you won't kill the insects. That was the idea. As he talked, he stressed 3 or 4 things. He stressed that he had had this experience. He was, as people called him, a Buddha. He never used the term himself. The term he preferred was Tathagata, one who has gone thus, has walked along this way. Buddhism is often said to be a revolt against Hinduism. It's a totally anachronistic statement that would have made no sense to the Buddha. What is Hinduism but India? The whole cultural matrix of India. What is true is that Buddha, his teachings and his movement, was one of many movements about the same time, which would include the Ajivikas, the Jains. People who developed a new spiritual path which challenged the pretensions of the Brahmins. How? First of all, he insisted that he was just an ordinary man who had this experience. In India, people tend to look at a holy man and say, wow, avatar. No, he said, I'm not an avatar. I'm just a man like you. The only difference is I have had this experience. Secondly, he said, no teaching should be accepted on the strength of tradition or authority. A challenge to the Brahmins, who taught with authority of the Vedas. You quote from the Vedas, that ends all arguments. Shabda Pramana. No, he said, a truth should be accepted only because one has recognized and realized it as true. Another thing he said was any man or woman can attain this enlightenment, irrespective of their accumulated karma, irrespective of their caste status. Again, a challenge to the Brahmins, who felt that only a Brahmin could attain the knowledge necessary to understand the Absolute, the Brahma. Another thing he said was, enlightenment can only be attained by your own effort. I can't give it to you. I can show you the way, but you have to walk the way. And the gods can't give it to you. So don't do puja to the gods to attain enlightenment. Now notice what he said. He did not say, don't do puja to the gods. What do people do puja to the gods for? For rain for their crops? To ward off floods? To hex an enemy? To get a son? To pass an exam? If you think the gods can give these things, by all means do puja. But don't do it for enlightenment, because they can't give it. This was his life then, wandering from place to place, talking with people, teaching them. In his old age, he spent a lot of time at Rajgriha in southern Bihar, which was then the capital of the kingdom of Maurya. He decided in his old age that he wanted to make one more trip back north toward his birthplace and set off with companions to do this. When he got fairly close to the modern city of Gorakhpur, he fell ill, and his companions took him to a row of trees at a place called Kushinara, or Kasya, where he passed away. It's about 55 miles east of the modern city of Gorakhpur. After his death, his disciples, as was the custom, cremated his body, put the ashes in 7 urns, and sent these 7 urns to 7 noble families in the areas where he had preached. When they received the urn, they did what was evidently a custom in those days. You dig a hole in the ground, you put the urn there, and you heap earth over it as a monument. The original and basic stupa. That was the Buddha. What did he teach? He said it's very simple. I can sum it up in 4 words. Dukkha, Samudaya, Nirodha, Marga. Dukkha, a hard word to translate. Most books in English translate it as sorrow or suffering. But it's much more than that. We can look at the life of people in the village who have nothing, who have no medical attention, and see that yes, their life is full of dukkha. Yes, but somebody who has everything. Someone like the Buddha, who has everything that money could buy in those days, a fine house to live in, a wonderful family, whatever he could ask for. Or in the modern context, a good job, plenty of money, a fine house, your own Mercedes, your computer, your Nokia, sales, everything. But in the end, you get old, you get sick, you die, and you leave it all. You're frustrated. That's the idea. It's a kind of basic ontological frustration, which comes from the second truth, samudaya. Where does this frustration come from? He says at the very center of our being, we have what word? Desire is what it's usually translated as. The Sanskrit word is trishna, which is thirst, which is a better word. Because if you've ever really been thirsty, walking in the desert, completely dried out, you know what an all-consuming desire it is to find water. Thirst. We have a thirst at the center of our being to acquire money, property, friends, degrees, reputation, whatever you want. But in the end, we get old, we get sick, we die, and we leave it all. So we're frustrated. The frustration comes from that desire. The third thing he said, I understood, is there is a time when this desire ceases. And the word he used for that was nirvana. Another word that's caused a lot of trouble. And not only to foreigners trying to understand Buddhism. There's 2 fat volumes written by a Polish chap by the name of Sterwacki on the meanings of nirvana down through the last 2,500 years. People have had trouble defining it. Because the Buddha never defined it. He described it. What does nirvana mean? It means extinction, like blowing out a candle. Or perhaps better, one of these small oil lamps. You put a string in it, you light it. It burns for a few hours, but eventually the oil runs out and the light goes out. That's all it is. He described it. But then people want to know, well, what is nirvana? Is it something? And he said, no, nirvana is not something you get. And they say, ah, gotcha, nirvana is nothing. And then he said, no, nirvana is not nothing. And that is important to remember. Because that's what's been picked up so often by Western writers to say that it is a negative religion and a religion of nothingness. No, the Buddha said it's not nothingness. My way is a middle way between a kind of naive realism and nihilism. It's not nothingness. What is it? What is it like when you attain nirvana? I don't know. Nobody's ever attained nirvana and come back to tell us about it. So why speculate? We don't know. What we do know is the flame goes out. That's it. When one reaches this stage of enlightenment, one then reaches a stage of nirvana. The light goes out, the desire ceases. And then that person, if he retains that state, when he dies, he will pass into permanent nirvana and not return. He will therefore be a Buddha. But the early Buddhists decided to reserve the term Buddha for the historical Sakyamuni. And they referred to somebody else who had attained enlightenment as an arhat. A saint who had attained this was called an arhat. And so this was the ideal of a monk, to become an arhat. Lastly, he said there's a way, there's a path, a road, marga, that you can follow in order to attain this enlightenment. And it has 8 aspects, the Ashtanga Marga. First, a right view of life. What does that mean? Samyak Dristi. The knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, yes, but one other thing. It's a tricky thing to get a hold of. The non-existence of the self. Now what does this mean? This becomes a problem. No self. You see? No. We are not saying no soul. This is not a metaphysical statement. We are not saying there is no Atman in the Brahman's definition of Atman. It's rather like this. Look, there's a table there. You call that thing a table, you know what a table is. If I ask you to go in the other room and bring a table, you know what it is. But if I bring a hammer here and knock this table apart, what do you have? A few pieces of wood, a few nails, a piece of formica. Where did the table go? The table is not a permanent, eternal thing. It's a convenient name we put on something arranged like this. And you go around and look at everything that we are aware of, everything that we know, and the same is true. If we look at ourselves, we know that we change. We were once little children, now we've grown up. We become adults. Eventually we get old, our hair falls out. We change. Things that were very important to me as a child, I no longer care about. Ideas that I thought were great discoveries when I went to college, I've abandoned. We know we forget things. How many adults would like to take a high school test in algebra? And yet we feel at the very center of our being there is something that is permanent and unchanging, which we call the self. And the Buddha said, no, keep looking at that. You'll see that changes also. It's rather like this. We have a river just outside here called the Bhagmati. A fellow might say, I like to walk along the Bhagmati every morning. And the Buddha would say, you think the Bhagmati is real? You saw today is halfway to Patna by tomorrow. Well, but you know banks. They'll tell you their grandfather moves. It changes. Think about it. And you will see that the only thing that is there, day after day, year after year, century after century, if you want, is the flow. Now this comes very close to what modern psychologists mean when they say the ego is not a thing, it's a process. Again, we're not talking in metaphysical terms, we're talking in psychological terms. The second aspect is right resolve, a resolve to renunciation, to benevolence, not to harm any living creatures. Next is speech. It does not consist of lies, gossip, and idle talk. Next is right conduct. Avoid taking things not given. Now this is an awkward phrase that has two meanings. One for the monk, one for the layperson. For the monk it means the monk must live by alms. For everybody it obviously means don't steal. But the monk must live by alms. He goes out each day to beg. If people give him something, he eats. If they don't give him something, well, he doesn't eat that day. He has no right to steal it. So avoid taking things not given and any kind of debauchery. Again, what this refers to is sexual activity. The monk should be celibate. The layperson, though, would be married with one wife and faithful to that wife. Next is right livelihood, the pursuit of a harmless way of earning a living, one that does not cause suffering to other living beings. Okay, so it kind of rules out being a soldier. You can't be a butcher. But you can't be a farmer either. Why? Because every time you dig in your field, you slice up a few worms. So what does that leave? In a basically agricultural society. Trade. Trade. And in fact, a very large percentage of the Buddhist lay people and the giants, for whom this was even stricter, were, and the giants still are, business people, traders. Which also helps to explain the spread of Buddhism. These people were traveling all over India and to parts beyond India, east and west. The last three aspects refer to meditation and mind control. Right effort, the attempt to ward off unwholesome mental phenomena and produce wholesome ones. Next, right awareness, attentiveness, awareness of the body, sensations, mind, and mental objects. And this is the root, of course, of all of the various systems of Vipassana meditation. And lastly, right meditation itself, Samyak Samadhi, promotes understanding in order to purify one's thoughts so that one can detach oneself from the world. So the Buddha's basic teachings are very simple. Those 4 words and the way is the last one. Now, The scholars and the grammarians later on would write volumes about each one of these, divide them and subdivide them and so on. But in fact, it's very simple. The third thing the Buddhists talk about when they describe their religion is the Sangha. Sangha means a group, a community. And it refers first of all to the community of monks. But before long it was expanded. From the very beginning, those who joined the Buddha joined a wandering life. He was a wanderer. He moved around. And they did also. And very soon people began to use for them a word that was an old word, that was already used, and that is bhikshu. Bhikshu means basically a religious mendicant, a religious person like a sannyasi who lives by begging. He had already adopted the lifestyle of the Indian ascetic when he left home, with a shaven head and wearing the saffron robe. So for the bhikshus or monks, he devised a two-step initiation process. If a man came and said, "I want to become a monk," he would first question him and see how sincere he was and so on. And then if he felt he was sincere, he went through a rite which became known as the prabraja, which means going out from ordinary life and from the family, or going out. Exit from the world. And his head would be completely shaved, which symbolized he left everything, his family, his wealth, and his caste status, which was symbolized by the chura. Then he was invested with a saffron robe, told to practice the first 5 rules of discipline, that I'll speak about in a moment. And for 2 years he was known as a sramanera, a novice. At the end of the 2 years, if he was still attracted to the life, there was a further step. If he said, "I want to make a more permanent commitment," fine. The whole ceremony, the same ceremony actually, was repeated again, but this time known as the Upasampada. Again, his head was shaved, he was given the saffron robes, the begging bowl, and he was told now he must observe all 10 of the rules of discipline, the Dashashila. Though this was a more permanent commitment, the monk has freely chosen this way of life because he says he is seeking enlightenment. If a time comes when he no longer wants to walk this path, he's free to go. In fact, the other monks don't want him around if he's not serious. Now, this perhaps should be stressed because in some places there is social pressure, social discrimination against a monk who leaves, especially after many years. Sri Lanka is one such place. In Thailand, you have the opposite. Probably 2/3 of any of the people walking around Thailand at any given time in saffron robes are in fact temporary monks. They become monks for 6 months or a year, oftentimes after they complete their studies, to think about life, decide what they want to do, and then return to lay life. Quite acceptable. I have met many people, some of them quite well-known university professors, social workers, who were monks for many years and decided, "I want to do something else." The life of the monks imitated the life of the Buddha. He was a wanderer, they were also wanderers. As it grew and developed, though, the Buddha decided, well, yes, but then let's divide the area up into sort of districts, which they call sima. And so all the monks in a sima should stay in their own sima, and twice a month, every fortnight, they should come together for a ritual that actually became known as the Upa. When they came together, the basic teachings of the Buddha. Later on, this became a sort of confession ceremony. But that was the idea. Then another custom arose. During the rainy season, all the monks in the Asima, in a district, would come together and spend the season together. Some years ago, I was doing a survey of Theravada monks. What I was asking them is, how long have you been a monk? How many rainy season retreats since you've become a monk? Oh, 34. They all knew this, which is the same question under a different picture. After all, we're talking about North Bihar and UP, principally. There are still many places down there where the only way you can get around during the monsoon is on an elephant or a tractor. Not a good time to go walking from village to village. Whatever its origin, from this then grew the idea that, well, if they're going to spend the rainy season together, they have to have a place to live. A residence, a monastery, which was called a vihara. And so from this then came monasteries. A monk would join a monastery. He would have a stable place to live, still be a wanderer. One thing the Buddha learned in his years of trial and error was starving yourself is not conducive to a religious life. An experience many others have had, including Ignatius. Next is the monk must abstain from the use of ornaments. Now, if you look at the statuary that has survived from the Hindu period of India, before the Muslims, places like Sarnath, Hindu shrines like Khajuraho, Konark, you'll notice how much jewelry everybody wore, men and women. Bracelets, necklaces, anklets, all sorts of things. So it was very common, but not for the monk. Next, the monk must abstain from dancing, singing, music, the theater. I suppose that would include Hindi movies. Next, something was evidently a great sign of luxury in those days. The monk must avoid high and soft beds. He must sleep on the floor on a mat. And lastly, the monk must not accept gold and silver. He lives by begging. Originally, he would beg cooked food and eat it there. With the establishment of monasteries, it became quite acceptable for people to give to the monks supplies that they would use when they needed it. So after the harvest, give a couple sacks of grain. Bring some cloth that the monks could use to make their robes, whatever it is. But they should not accept gold and silver. But this is the basic discipline of the monk. It seems that in the beginning, the Buddha was interested in attracting as followers only men who wanted to follow his way of life, that is, become bhikshus. As time went on, two things happened. First, we know from his biography that after some years, he returned to his home, to Kapilavastu, after he had become a Buddha. And according to the stories, his mother had died when he was an infant, and he was raised by an aunt called Prajapati. When he went back home, the old lady was still alive. And so she and her friends used to come and listen to what the Buddha had to say when he was preaching. And she came to him one day and she said, "You know, I and my lady friends, we like what you have to say. We would like to become your followers. We would like to become bhikshunis." He said, "Bhikshunis? Who ever heard of bhikshunis? I mean, women don't become ascetics. No, this is not a good idea. You remain at home." and follow my teachings. A few days later he left and went on to Vaisali. After he'd been in Vaisali a while, she shows up. And she said, you know, I asked you when you were home about us becoming bhikshunis. I know you said no, but we've been thinking about it, and we still want to become bhikshunis. He says, look, I told you. There's no question of women become ascetics. Go away, go back home. And so she went off again. And so he figured that's the end of that. But it wasn't. Pretty soon she's back again, according to the story, with her 500 followers, with her head shaved, wearing saffron robes, and say, we want to become bhikshunis. So at this point he called some of his closest disciples and said, what do you think? Well, you say, however, he agreed with a proviso. The proviso was the bhikshuni sangha must always be subject to the bhikshu sangha. An arrangement not without historical parallels. The next thing that happened was others would come and say, look, I like your teaching, I would like to follow it, but I can't do it, at least not now. I've got a wife, I've got 3 little kids, I've got a farm to look at. I can't just walk off and leave them. Is there nothing for me? And he says, yes, there is. If you will take those first 5 rules of discipline, adapt them to your way of life, live that, then you will be taking the first steps along the road to enlightenment. Above all, you will be gaining good karmic merit, punya. And so we began to get now laymen and laywomen who were officially dedicated to following the way of the Buddha. Later the Buddha would talk about the Sangha as a building supported by 4 pillars. Bhikshus, bhikshunis, laymen, upasika, laywomen, upasika. The lay people, the key for understanding the life of the Buddha's layman, especially in the early days, was the idea of gaining good karmic merit. What is the principal field of merit for the layperson? The monastic sangha, supporting the monks. So they all worked together, and they supported the monasteries out of the sense of duty toward supporting all the various spiritual ways within their kingdom. Now let's come back again to the stupa. When the Buddha died, his ashes were put in the ground, they heaped up earth. These ashes were in 7 famous places. Immediately, those 7 places became places of pilgrimage. You make offerings. Pushpa, Dhupa, Dipa, Gandha, Naivedya. Flowers, light, incense, scent, food. This is what Indians do when they go to a holy place. As time went on, people said, now that earthen mound, why don't we decorate it a bit? So it was covered with stone. And then they put nice railings around it and carvings. In the beginning, they did not have images of the Buddha, but they had symbols, the 2 feet, the umbrella. The umbrella was put on top of the stupa. It's a nice high place. You climb up there, you get a nice view of the area around, so put a railing so people don't fall off. So you have the harmika, you have the umbrella on top. Later on, about the beginning of the Christian era, Buddhists began to make images of the Buddha. And this began in far western India, in Gandhara, which is now part of Pakistan. And interestingly enough, the earliest Buddhist images show a very strong Greek influence, because it originated in those Greek kingdoms, the Bactrian kingdoms. But the idea caught on and spread throughout India. Soon the style changed to a strictly Indian style. And so then you had images of the Buddha. Gradually, after some years, the stupa needs repair, so you put another layer on top and another layer on top. So that if you excavate these ancient stupas in India today, they look a bit like onions, layer after layer of expansion. The stupa then became the symbol of Buddhism, as the cross is for Christianity, as the crescent is for Islam. Every monastery would have a hall where the monks would gather. They look very much like medieval cathedrals, except that in place of the altar, you have a stupa. Now, with the coming of the Jesuits, then they began to put images in the hall, and the stupa went back outside. But every Buddhist establishment would have a stupa. The original idea, of course, was that they would all have a relic of the Buddha. And in the time of the Emperor Ashoka, the original stupas were open, and the relics sent around all over the Buddhist world. Later on, other Buddhist saints were put into the stupas. Even later, they were simply memorial stupas or simply votive offerings. But the stupa became the center of the Buddhist worship. Now, I stress this a bit because so often it is said in books that are written in the West that originally Buddhism was a philosophy. It was not a religion. Well, that early Buddhism is what is practiced in Thailand and Sri Lanka. I sat once in the temple of the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok, and it was a festival day. So there was a constant stream of people coming all morning into the temple. What were they doing? The same thing my old neighbor does every morning when she goes to the Ganesh shrine. They come in, they light a lamp, they make offerings, and they pray.